From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Dubai, a glittering city in the desert, with shiny skyscrapers and glamorous resorts, streets lined with palm trees and sandy beaches.
A city that redefines the luxury experience. I'm talking about fine dining, breathtaking views from the sky, yacht cruises in the Arabian Sea, and of course, vintage rides that have you looking like a movie star.
It's a city that celebrates opulence and luxury.
Picture this, yoga at the highest 360 infinity pool in the world, exclusive access and packages to ultra-luxurious dining and experiences.
Helicopters, luxury cars, infinity pools and exclusive yachts. Who lives in a place like this? Well, for the first time ever, we can see exactly who owns property in Dubai. And it's not just the wealthy international elite. Among the tycoons and businessmen is an array of intriguing characters.
It is kind of like a police most wanted list. We've got a number of people who are on the Interpol red list. We've got significant numbers of fraudsters in the UK.
Working alongside an international network of journalists, two reporters at The Times have been ferreting through the data to find the identities of British property owners in Dubai.
Another person we found was a man who was prosecuted for fraud. He and his associates stole about 12 million from the NHS mostly and other government bodies. They prevented temporarily from an entire new mental health unit in Lincolnshire from being built because the money just disappeared.
Why has Dubai become such a hub for nefarious characters? And can the authorities from around the world get their most wanted criminals and their money back? The story today: Dubai Unlocked.
My name's George Greenwood. I'm one of the Times' investigations team, and I do a lot of work on fraud and money laundering. So when offered the chance to work on this project, I grabbed it both hands.
And I'm Emma Yeomans. I'm a general news reporter for The Times, so I cover a very broad range of topics. I have a real interest in collaborative work with colleagues around the world, and that's how I got involved in this project.
George, this is an amazing maze of a story. Just starting off with one of the characters involved. Tell us about Abid Hussain.
So Mr. Hussain was a quite well-connected businessman from Leeds. He was very close to his local MP, Fabian Hamilton, who even gave him a tour around number 10 Downing Street, and he even met then Prime Minister Gordon Brown back in 2010. And there's a wonderful picture of them all together.
At Downing Street?
In Downing Street. Now, he appears to have been able to pull the wool over people's eyes quite well, because his local MP, Fabian Hamilton, was very happy to give him a character reference for his court case when some concerns about money going awry came to light. Unfortunately, that may have not been the best idea for Mr. Hamilton.
What did he say about him?
Well, Mr. Hamilton described Mr. Hussain as a moral and very honest person, and told the court, I find that completely unlikely that this money was laundered. I was so shocked when I heard that. It was far more likely that the bag of money was full of a bag of leaflets or some literature. And I understand it was a carrier bag full of his charity leaflets.
You mean, hang on, this is a man who's literally carrying a carrier bag full of money?
Yes, indeed. And the court was hearing this as evidence from the police. Now, it turns out that Hussain was guilty, and he was given a sentence around 2 years.
What was he actually charged with?
So Mr. Hussain ran a chain of stores in Leeds. And unfortunately for him, this was found to have been used to launder money for organised criminals. So money laundering is often where you claim to make X amount of cash but actually you make much less of that, and the difference is made up by cash earned from illegal activities. This hides it from authorities and gets it into the legitimate banking system. So he was charged with money laundering and sentenced to 2 years of prison. He was subject to a confiscation order. Police do have powers to seize assets linked to criminal cases and to require repayment of the value of those assets. Now, in the case of Hussein, he did repay around £300,000. The police confirmed this with us.
That's quite a character to have inside number 10 and described by his local MP as a moral man. What happens to him when he goes to jail?
Well, this has been the quite flabbergasting revelations from this investigation. When we were looking through documents and looking at which British criminals had managed to buy property there, Mr. Hussein came up. But what was interesting about him wasn't just that he bought property in Dubai, but when he'd managed to do it. We were able to access the transactions database of Dubai, and it showed that at the time, Mr. Hussein was supposed to be in a Category C prison in the UK. He was actually buying 2 apartments in a luxury part of Dubai.
Oh, wow. How is that even possible?
We're still not sure. We've asked the Ministry of Justice to explain it in more detail. It may be people acting on his behalf, buying it in his name, for example, but whatever the practicalities, Mr. Hussein bought luxury Dubai property from his prison cell.
And these weren't the only properties he owned out in Dubai.
No, he was released in January 2014. He then bought another property very shortly after he left. Maybe a get-out-of-jail present to himself. 3 properties in a tower right next to the Burj Khalifa. Those who don't know, this is, I think, the tallest building in the world, and it really does stun when you look up at it. And there's a lovely palm tree and water feature area around that building, a public park. And then his property, something called the Standpoint Tower, looks out over that area. So it's a rather pleasant place to be.
Emma, how do we know about these properties now?
We know about these properties because The Times is part of a fairly extraordinary international collaboration. It's a project that's been termed Dubai Unlocked. Over the last few years, an American nonprofit, the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, has been receiving a steady leak of data from the Dubai Land Registry. This data is effectively a snapshot of people who owned or bought property in Dubai around 2022. There's another version of it dated 2020. This was passed to us via contacts of mine at the OCCRP, the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and individual journalists who took us on board, and we have been looking at the UK figures in this data.
Give us a sense. I mean, you mentioned there are a couple of organisations. This is sort of a conglomerate of journalists and investigators almost around the world. Just give us a sense of how big this net is.
Yes, a couple is probably underplaying it. There's somewhere between 60 and 80 outlets. To be honest, I lost track of it this morning because there were several more on the list I'd actually never heard of. So we've got somewhere between 60 and 80 outlets, and I think we're up to about 200 journalists around the world.
Wow, so these are newspapers and television channels in different countries all over Europe, all over
the world. I have heard of reporters everywhere from Comoros, off the coast of Africa,
that is
through to Indonesia, South America, and pretty much every European country now. Just last week, I was speaking quite extensively with the partners in Ukraine and one of the stories they're working on. There's another wonderful piece of work being done around Myanmar. It really is global.
That's incredible. And The Times has got involved as the British partner looking through all of this information. George, when you get access to a huge data dump like this, how do you begin to make sense of it?
So when I was first hired by The Times, I was hired as a data journalist, and I specialised in going through these vast data sets to look for stories, doing data analysis using computer code and programs. And when I moved to the investigations team, I've continued that and spent my time applying these techniques to investigations to find information that other techniques just don't let you get at. With this kind of investigation where we've got a data set of many people, but are not quite sure where to look, more and more journalists are using computer programming techniques to try and analyse and find the best leads that data can provide. This somewhat turns the normal journalistic process on its head. Instead of using a source to find more information, you have the information already, but you're trying to find out what's most relevant. In this case, we used computer programming to match the names of people who featured in this database with names of people we think would be interesting. In particular, people who were disqualified directors in the UK, people who were bankrupts, people who were on sanctions lists, and people who have been convicted of UK offences. And in this situation, what it led us to do is to get from thousands of individuals who were featuring to a few hundred we thought were most interesting.
Wow.
And then we just split the list and started working through them and looked at some people will be false positives, some people will be passed away, some people might have been acquitted of things that they are featured in the list for. But let us really narrow it down to people who are UK convicts, people who have been convicted in the UK of criminal offences, people who are civilly charged with things like VAT fraud, people who were on the run. It let us get this list down into a way that we could really focus on the cases that were most important.
And just give me a sense of the sort of people you've come across and the sort of crimes that they've committed.
So we do see a really broad range of people investing in Dubai. And I think before we get into who we found, it's important to note that not everyone who invests in the property market there is doing so with illegitimate funds. It's very, very easy to invest in the Dubai property market and to maintain a degree of privacy while you do so. And there are perfectly legitimate reasons for people to do that. One of the reasons it's so private is because of the way the land registry there is structured. It's quite hard to search without the kind of information that is available to, say, a lawyer. Just an address and a name won't necessarily get you a lot of information. So this gives it a degree of privacy which is attractive to all sorts of people, many of whom have perfectly legitimate interests.
And with that in mind, there are many people there with perfectly legitimate reasons. You've also come across quite a lot of convicted criminals.
It is kind of like a police most wanted list, looking through our leads document. And I mean that in the literal sense. We've got a number of people who are on the Interpol Red List, which is an appeal to global law enforcement for help urgently tracking a person down. We've got significant numbers of fraudsters in the UK. That was a really big pattern. Tax cheats. One guy who left for Dubai after he was wanted for manslaughter in the UK. And there's a lot of people who are connected to some of the worst names in global politics, you know, the dictators, the autocrats, people linked to Lukashenko in Belarus or President Assad. We've got associates of Ramzan Kadyrov as well. It really goes on and on. This list. Yes, the Chechen leader who's seen as very close to Putin and has been very heavily involved in the conflict in Ukraine. So we've really got a huge, great list. For me, the standouts, or one of them, was the number of properties owned by associates of the Kinahan cartel, Daniel Kinahan and his organised crime family. Also on our international list, there are people who are really quite scary and sinister. We've got Ahmad Hassan Mohammed al-Asiri. Al-Asiri is the Saudi spy chief who was sanctioned by the US and is considered to be the ringleader of the assassination of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. He owns an apartment and a villa worth around £1 million in the Jumeirah Park neighbourhood.
And you've got the dictators, the people who are on sanctions lists, the people who are wanted internationally. What I was really struck by is you also have people who, in some ways, might seem like they're small-time criminals, but who carry out terrible crimes in this country.
Another person we found was a man called Imtiaz Koda, who was prosecuted for fraud. He and his associates stole about 12 million from the NHS mostly and other government bodies. They did this by forging bank statements, invoices to appear to be the companies who an NHS was contracting to. They prevented temporarily from an entire new mental health unit in Lincolnshire from being built because the money just disappeared.
How awful.
And he owned quite extensive holdings in Dubai. Some of it at one point appeared to be rented out. He seemed to be working as a developer as well. He had buildings named things like Kensington Towers, Knightsbridge Court. These were really comfortable looking, blocks of flats with shared pools, nice places to be. Some of that we think was ultimately sold and the profits returned to the NHS, but it's still unclear exactly how much was successfully recovered from him.
Emma, We've been talking about the amazing data dump which has allowed you to compile a who's who of criminals who own property, luxury property in Dubai. One of the names you mentioned was the Kinahans. They are a very famous crime family. We've done podcasts on them before, but just for people who haven't come across them, remind us of what they're accused of.
Daniel Kinahan and his father, Christy Kinahan, and his brother, also Christy Kinahan, are accused of running a pretty major international drugs cartel. They've been linked also to match fixing and betting, as well as a variety of gangland hits. There are a lot of accusations out there about the Kinahans. They were sanctioned by the US about 2 years ago as narcotics kingpins, effectively, as running a major transnational organised crime group. So they have been on the run for quite a long time now. They are believed to be, or were believed to be, in Dubai, and they have been sought there in the past.
And when you found them in this data, it's not actually the name Kinahan that comes up, is it?
So yes and no. There is Daniel Kinahan himself. I mentioned earlier that we have effectively two versions of this property list, a 2020 and a 2022. Certainly in 2020, before the US sanctions, Daniel himself is named, owning an office which we established was being used by one of his companies, which again is believed to be a front for his crime gang. By 2022, Kinahan is now under sanctions. Dubai has been ordered to freeze his assets. He does not appear. Who pops up instead is Kiva Robinson, his wife.
Aha.
So Kiva and Daniel were married in Dubai. They had this luxury wedding at the Burj Al Arab Hotel, which is one of only, I think, about 5 to 10 7-star hotels in the world. So luxurious, I had to look up what 7-star meant.
I can't say I've experienced it.
Neither have I. But
out of interest, what does make it 7 stars? I mean, are you literally walking on gold dust to enter?
The description of a 7-star hotel is a hotel that significantly exceeds even the luxury and premium service required to earn 5 stars. I don't think there are specifics about how, but you've got to be pretty good. You've got to be pretty nice.
This is as luxe as it gets, and this is where they have their wedding reception.
That is where they're married, and this was in 2017. Before Daniel was as heavily wanted as he is now. And it's an extraordinary wedding, partly because it was described as a who's who list of the world's most notorious crime bosses. He invited the lot.
So this sounds like an extraordinary cast of characters. Not the nicest people. Quite a lot of guns, I imagine.
Maybe not one to bring to your tea party.
Probably quite a scary wedding, I would say, with that cast. But they're married, and fairly soon after, Kiva sets out on buying up property. So about 3 months later, she buys this very, very nice looking flat, 300 square metre apartment overlooking the marina for about £750,000. It's in the elite residences building. And this is the first of her property investments. She sold it this year for a profit of about £150,000, something like that. And then shortly after, she buys a villa in a suburb for about 3.6 million.
Wow.
So that she's got money. She's got money. She's done very, very well at this point financially. And it's not entirely clear where the funds for these properties are coming from. And that's when we remember who her husband is. So she rents this villa in an area called Parkway Vistas. It definitely has a pool. We can see it has a fairly nice, large-looking pool. And it's a substantial-sized villa in a sort of residential suburb just outside the main city of Dubai, overlooking a golf course. Looking at the development, it seems like it's a pretty exclusive neighbourhood too.
So this is quite luxury.
She's living well. So then she buys that in 2018, and in May 2020, she starts renting it out. And also in our data, Robinson's name also appears alongside another villa. This was bought for $5 million in 2020 in the Emirates Hills development. It's enormous, 2,200 square metres.
That's huge.
Yeah, it's a large villa. And it was sold in May last year for close to 10 million, so more than doubling in price.
Wow. That's an enormous profit.
Yeah, it is an enormous profit. But I think the really interesting aspect is that it's sold in May 2023. This is a year after Kinahan's been sanctioned. Kiva herself, she's not subject to any sanctions. There's no arrest warrant for her. It's his assets that are frozen only. And when the UAE decided to freeze his assets, it was described at the time as the net closing in on the Kinahans. There was a real feeling that this might be the beginning of the end for him. But it hasn't been. He's still on the run. And I think it's really interesting to see what a substantial contribution to their lifestyle, and to her lifestyle particularly, the Dubai property market is making. It certainly seems like, it certainly could be the case that this is funding them while he's on the run.
That's remarkable. What is it about Dubai that seems to attract so many criminals to buy or invest in property there?
So the problem international authorities have is firstly, it's not a rule of law state. So
What exactly does that mean?
as a dictatorship, it doesn't necessarily have to deport people it doesn't want to. There's also a high degree of having different favourites. So if they don't want to deport something, they might not. It's also a place where cash is king. One of our reporting partners, SVT in Sweden, rang up one of the agents who offered them, I think, to take up to £20 million in bags of cash outside the country to fly abroad, pick it up, and then buy them a property.
This is an estate agent.
It's an estate
willing
agent.
to come and collect literally bags of cash.
Yeah.
They describe it as full cash. They say you can purchase with full cash if you're worried about your bank accounts. And
That's
full
amazing.
cash can be as much as 100 million dirhams or more. 100 million dirhams, which is local currency there, equates to about 20 million pounds.
Wow.
And they absolutely pledge, no questions asked.
So there's a complete lack of meaningful due diligence. I think our reporting shows there's a willingness to turn a blind eye, I think, on behalf of authorities. And there are cases where people are extradited back from Dubai, but it often only happens after several years of aggressive lobbying by usually reasonably powerful states in Europe. And then it just gets too awkward for Dubai, and eventually, as long as the person's not politically connected, they might deport them back to the country that's looking to get them. So it's very hard to get deported by Dubai if you have money. And also, there's a wider issue here, which is that the UAE is largely dependent on oil. The UAE economy historically has relied on oil sales to really keep it afloat. And that's coming to an end at some point in the future. And what Dubai is trying to do with its property market is to create an alternative source of income for the government through property taxes. And to do that, they're willing to accept money from anywhere. And I think because the property market's so big, in some ways it's very easy to hide as well. If you want to own a few less luxury properties on the outskirts of Dubai, you want to pay in cash and you want to go through an agent that doesn't ask many questions. Realistically, as long as you can get a bank transfer of some kind or a crypto transfer, or even, as we said, bags of cash, you'll be able to get an asset in your name. In practice, it means that the country is a giant bank account for criminals.
And again, just to clarify, not everyone on this database will have used illicit funds. But what makes Dubai so popular as a destination for investment is that you're not really asked about the source of your funds. It's like the estate agent said, no questions asked.
I mean, I've come across a lot of this in investigations. I've investigated families who've just moved to Dubai to escape extradition orders and got away with it. Property, which British courts have said needs to be given to somebody, and it gets taken to Dubai because nobody then can reach it.
Yeah.
And also it's become a real hub for Russians who are escaping sanctions at the moment. All of their money seems to be ending up in Dubai. Is there not a lot of international pressure on Dubai now to do something about that?
So there is, especially around sanctions evasion, particularly around trade of critical military components. And Dubai has been a bit of a hub for this. But I think when it comes to, as you say, Russians moving there, one thing we have to remember is Dubai is just quite fun. It's a holiday destination. You can go surfing, you can go water skiing, you can eat the finest food. So if you're a Russian, you can't go to London anymore. Dubai is another option where it is a party town. You can live a really high quality life there if you have money. It's not only a place you can store wealth, but actually a place you can live. And certainly Russians are going there in large numbers to do exactly that.
And where you won't be sanctioned.
Where you won't be sanctioned, where your property and assets will be freely moved through the banks, unless you really are the top tier. And then you can use wallets, family members, other ways to get away from the chance of international pressure. So Dubai is under a lot of pressure, but also it's successfully resisting that pressure to some extent. And while there are some victories in terms of extraditions, and we've got the case of Sanjay Shah, for example, this $1.7 billion Danish VAT fraudster who has recently been extradited, the extraditions tend to require a lot of pressure, and it tends to be for people that Dubai just doesn't really care about, i.e. we'll take your money, but if it's more hassle than it's worth, we might deport you. But at a certain point, like, that's only a certain number of people.
And what did the authorities in Dubai tell you when you approached them?
We went to the UAE via their embassy in the UK. They gave us the following statement. The UAE takes its role in protecting the integrity of the global financial system extremely seriously. In February, the Financial Action Task Force, the global standard setter for measures to fight money laundering, praised the UAE's significant progress. In its continuing pursuit of global criminals, the UAE works closely with international partners to disrupt and deter all forms of illicit finance. The UAE is committed to continuing these efforts and actions more than ever today and over the longer term.
What have the authorities here told you about how they view what's happening in Dubai?
Well, we went to the National Crime Agency. They are the lead department on overseas pursuit of criminals. And they say that asset recovery involving international partners can be a complex process, not least because of differing legal regimes for such recovery and the need to develop intelligence and evidential cases across different jurisdictions. Despite these challenges, we have in recent years developed our partnership with the UAE and welcome the deepening cooperation. We recognise there is more to be done together and continue to enhance efforts to combat the illicit finance threat that harms both our countries.
HMRC were another organisation we went to because of the number of British fraudsters out there who had defrauded the taxman, effectively. And HMRC, they weren't able to give us a specific figure for how much they've returned from Dubai in terms of cash, but they did say all law enforcement agencies face challenges when seizing assets abroad, but we continue to seize assets where international treaties are in place and the legal requirements are met. And that HMRC continues to work tirelessly with international partners to ensure criminals do not profit from their ill-gotten gains. They were also able to clarify to us that at least 73 fugitives have been returned to the UK, tax fugitives that is, including from Dubai, and that they are working quite closely with the UAE thanks to a new agreement. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we've got everyone.
And also, we've been approaching police forces around the country that investigated some of the individuals we've mentioned. They say they're now seeking more information with a view to potentially trying to recover some of the assets we reported to them.
Did you manage to speak to any of the people who are criminals or officially bankrupt and yet have bought property in Dubai?
So we reached out to everybody we've mentioned in the podcast for comment. Most of them were not willing to give us any sort of response. However, a representative for Mr. Abid Hussein did get in touch, who said Hussein had no knowledge of any such allegations or investigations in Dubai and denied all knowledge of any properties in the UAE. Fabian Hamilton, the Labour MP who took Mr. Hussein around Downing Street, said that the decision to do so was regrettable in hindsight, said that he had had no contact with Mr. Hussein for 10 years, and at the time of Hamilton's statement to the courts, he had believed he was a genuine community activist. And I should also say that the NCA, the law enforcement agency, says that its officers have no charge over assets which are not associated with criminality or the profits of criminality. What that means in practice is that when someone like Hussein has paid off a confiscation order from the courts in full, the NCA can't go after any of their other assets.
For both of you, doing an investigation like this, on this scale, does it feel frustrating to know that very little will probably change? You know, we've had the Panama Papers in the past, we've had the Paradise Papers, and yet these places where the proceeds of crime seem to be able to be stashed away and nobody can get at them continue to exist.
Well, you can light a candle or you can scream into the dark. I think with all these kind of investigations, it's about getting as much of this stuff on the public record as possible, because times do change. Maybe not now, but in 10 years' time, you know, maybe there's a change in international pressure, and suddenly by knowing these things are there or having access to the information, more can be done about it. I think with a lot of this kind of journalism, it's worth thinking about not only are you necessarily changing something today, you hope to change these things in the future, but also I think it's good to hold our own police forces to account or authorities to account and to point, you know, where they may need to focus more efforts. And I think the role of the press in doing that is crucially valuable.
When the ICIJ released the Panama Papers, first they released the stories through newspapers, through the broadcasters, and then they released the database. And we are now significantly down the line from that, but that's still there. If you are a lawyer working on a fraud case in the UK and you think, I wonder if my client ever used a Panamanian company, you can find that out. You can find that information because that's still out there. When these things are in the public domain, anyone can use them. And that means anyone, whether they are a police officer or a victim of fraud, can choose to have a look and see if they can find something useful that could help an investigation. So it is frustrating that so little has changed since these types of collaborations started hitting the headlines, a decade ago. But equally, I do think there's been help that we haven't seen yet. And even within that, only this year, another group of people were taken to court for their role in money laundering linked to the Panama Papers. So I actually am probably more positive than some of my colleagues are, because I think we see the benefits of these investigations, and those benefits don't stop the moment of publication. They will keep going.
That was Emma Yeomans and George Greenwood. And you can read more about the Dubai Unlocked investigation online at thetimes.co.uk with a subscription. And there will be more revelations from this data dropping over the next few days, so keep an eye out. The producer today was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme tune were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts and recommend us to any of your friends. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.